Derek Williams wiped sweat from his forehead with a concrete-stained bandana as the August heat shimmered off the asphalt, making the moment he saw the fainted pregnant wife collapse seem almost dreamlike and surreal, her swollen 8-month belly making the fall exponentially more dangerous. The poor construction worker had been heading to his truck after a 14-hour shift when he noticed her stumble, her maternity dress stretched tight over her pregnant form as her expensive heels caught on uneven pavement before her body went limp and crashed against a parking meter with her belly taking impact. Derek helped the fallen pregnant woman immediately, his instincts overriding his exhaustion, his strong arms catching her carefully to protect both mother and unborn child before her head could strike the concrete again. But the weight of her unconscious pregnant body reminded him how fragile both lives truly were. He took her to the hospital emergency entrance just 2 blocks away, half running while cradling her and her unborn baby carefully, his lungs burning from exertion and concern, but determination pushed him forward when others might have simply called for help and disappeared. The emergency room staff rushed to assist once Derek burst through the doors carrying the unconscious pregnant woman, but the chaos of a Friday evening meant delayed care and endless paperwork that revealed a situation more troubling than any medical complication. Her husband left her completely alone. No emergency contact answered the hospital's calls. No family appeared despite multiple attempts to reach someone, and the fainted pregnant wife had been abandoned in the most vulnerable moment of her crisis, 8 months pregnant and collapsed on a city street. Her husband left her to marry her best friend, a detail that would emerge when she regained consciousness and explain through broken sobs why nobody was coming to help her and her baby, why she'd been standing outside a lawyer's office discussing custody arrangements when she collapsed from stress and dehydration. The poor construction worker should have left once both mother and baby were stable, should have returned to his modest apartment to rest before tomorrow's early shift, but something about her situation resonated with memories of his own pregnant mother's abandonment by his father 25 years prior, a betrayal that had nearly killed both of them. Derek stayed through the night, sleeping awkwardly in a waiting room chair, bringing her water and prenatal-approved snacks when she woke, listening when she needed to talk about her husband's rejection of their unborn baby, but never prying when she fell silent while holding her belly protectively. This fainted pregnant wife possessed an elegance that survived even hospital gowns, tear-stained cheeks, and the swollen ankles of late pregnancy, a dignity that suggested a past very different from her present circumstances of abandonment. But Derek treated her exactly as he'd treat any pregnant woman in distress, with protective reverence and simple human decency. She was a secret trillionaire whose real name was Victoria Ashford, though she'd been living as Victoria Shaw for 3 years, concealing her identity as the sole heir to Ashford Enterprises, a multinational conglomerate worth $24 billion. But her pregnancy had become the ultimate test of her experiment. The secret trillionaire had orchestrated her own disappearance to discover whether genuine love existed outside her wealth's gravitational pull, and pregnancy had provided definitive answers when her husband chose her childhood friend over their marriage vows and their unborn child. The awards night coming in 10 days was the Ashford Legacy Gala, where she would resurface and reclaim her empire while visibly pregnant, revealing the social experiment she'd conducted and introducing the child her husband had rejected. But Derek knew nothing about her true identity as he offered her his spare bedroom when the hospital discharged her with nowhere safe for a pregnant woman to go. Derek's mother, a kind woman named Diane, welcomed Victoria with open arms and the special tenderness reserved for pregnant women, bringing her prenatal vitamins and healthy meals, never questioning her son's decision to help someone so vulnerable. Victoria stayed in Derek's modest apartment, her pregnancy progressing peacefully under his protective care, but neither of them knew that her ex-husband and his new wife were living lavishly across town, completely unaware that the pregnant woman they'd abandoned was secretly worth billions and planning her return. When his mother slapped her at the awards night, when Victoria's ex-husband's mother, Eleanor Montgomery, struck the heavily pregnant woman's face in front of 500 horrified guests after discovering her son had abandoned his pregnant wife, the ballroom fell into shocked silence that felt like the world had stopped breathing. His mother slapped her, believing Victoria had trapped her son with an unwanted pregnancy, believing the lies her son had told about Victoria being unstable and manipulative. But the elderly woman's hand striking a visibly pregnant woman created a moment of moral clarity that cameras captured from every angle. What she did in response, what the secret trillionaire did when his mother struck her pregnant face before hundreds of witnesses while she stood there 8 months pregnant and placed one hand protectively on her belly, demonstrated both grace and power in measures that left spectators breathless and changed business, history forever. What she did to crush him, the ex-husband who'd abandoned his pregnant wife and unborn child for her supposed best friend, left him careerless and bankrupt within 90 days, through revelations that exposed his embezzlement of funds meant for their baby's trust fund, his fraudulent architectural credentials, and his pattern of financial abuse that had been hidden behind her family's wealth and connections. How did a poor construction worker's decision to help a collapsed pregnant stranger create a cascade that would expose deception, deliver justice to those who harm pregnant women and unborn children, transform multiple lives, and demonstrate that the universe maintains perfect accounting of every deed, especially regarding the vulnerable? What happened when Eleanor Montgomery realized she'd just slapped the actual heir to the Ashford fortune while defending the son who'd lied to her about everything? Why did the image of Victoria holding her pregnant belly protectively while revealing her identity become the most powerful business photograph of the decade, sparking a global movement about protecting pregnant women and honoring those who defend them? What did she do that crushed the ex-husband so completely that he lost not just his career and money, but his reputation, his new marriage, and his relationship with his own mother, who disowned him after learning the truth? What this story will teach you. This story illustrates that genuine kindness toward pregnant women and unborn children requires no calculation of return, that abandoning one's pregnant wife and child carries compound interest that eventually bankrupts the betrayer completely, and that true wealth reveals itself through how people treat the most vulnerable members of society. You'll gain perspective on why protecting pregnant women is universally considered sacred across cultures, how authentic relationships create opportunities that manipulation destroys, why moral courage in protecting the vulnerable leads to extraordinary outcomes, and how societies measure their worth by how they treat mothers and unborn children. The narrative provides insights into relationship authenticity during pregnancy, the hidden costs of abandoning pregnant wives and unborn children, the unexpected rewards of protecting the most vulnerable, and how power used to defend the defenseless differs dramatically from power wielded with vengeance. Derek Williams had tasted concrete dust for so long that he barely noticed it anymore, but the metallic tang of blood in the air that Friday afternoon cut through everything else with surgical precision. He'd been walking toward his pickup truck parked 3 blocks from the construction site, his steel-toed boots leaving dusty prints on the scorching sidewalk, when he saw her stumble near the corner of 5th and Madison. The pregnant woman's hand reached out toward a streetlight pole, her fingers grasping at air as her knees buckled beneath the weight of her swollen belly, but the pole remained just inches beyond her desperate reach. Derek dropped his thermos without thinking, the clatter of metal against concrete barely registering in his mind as his legs propelled him forward with speed that contradicted his exhausted body. He covered 30 feet in seconds that felt like hours, his arms extending to catch her before gravity completed its cruel work, but he was 3 steps too far when her body hit the parking meter with a sickening thud that made his stomach turn. Her 8-month pregnant belly absorbed the initial impact against the metal post, her designer maternity dress tearing slightly as she collapsed onto the sidewalk in a heap of expensive fabric and vulnerable flesh. "Somebody call the ambulance!" Derek shouted to the crowd of pedestrians who'd formed a loose circle around them, their faces showing curiosity rather than concern, their phones raised to record rather than to help. He knelt beside the unconscious pregnant woman, his calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness as he checked her pulse at her neck, steady but weak, while his other hand hovered over her belly, afraid to touch, but desperate to know if the baby was still moving. The August sun beat down on them both, turning the concrete into a griddle that would burn exposed skin within minutes. But nobody in the crowd offered shade or assistance beyond their unwanted documentation. Derek's mind flashed back 25 years to a similar scene. His own mother, 6 months pregnant with his sister, collapsed on their apartment building's stairs while his father stood at the top, refusing to help, choosing that moment to announce he was leaving them both. Derek had been only 7 years old then, too small to catch her fall, forced to watch her tumble down 12 concrete steps while his father walked away without looking back. His mother had survived that fall, but the baby hadn't, and Derek had spent every day since that tragedy believing he should have been stronger, faster, better equipped to protect them. "I've got you," he whispered to the unconscious pregnant woman, carefully sliding one arm under her shoulders and another beneath her knees, lifting both mother and unborn child with the same arms that had carried steel beams and concrete blocks all day. She weighed almost nothing to him despite her pregnancy, her body surprisingly light in his grip, but the responsibility of 2 lives felt heavier than any construction material he'd ever hauled. The hospital entrance stood 2 blocks away, visible through the heat shimmer rising from the asphalt, and Derek began moving toward it with purposeful strides that ignored his body's screaming exhaustion. "Sir, you can't just carry her like that. You might hurt the baby," a woman's voice called from the crowd, her tone carrying judgment rather than genuine concern. But Derek didn't slow his pace or waste breath responding. Every second counted when a pregnant woman was unconscious. Every moment of delay could mean the difference between 2 heartbeats or 1, and he'd already wasted too much time hoping someone else would step forward to help. The crowd parted as he moved through them, their phones still recording, their faces still passive, their collective indifference reminding him why he'd learned long ago that the only person you could truly count on was yourself. The pregnant woman stirred slightly in his arms as he crossed the first block, her eyelids fluttering but not opening, her lips forming words that emerged as barely audible whispers. "My baby, please, my baby." The desperation in her unconscious plea cut through Derek's chest like a blade, sharpening his focus and lengthening his stride. He noticed details as he carried her, the expensive fabric of her torn maternity dress, the diamond wedding ring still on her left hand despite no husband rushing to her aid, the designer purse that had fallen beside her and that nobody in the crowd had bothered to retrieve. "Both of you are going to be fine," Derek promised her, though he had no medical training to back up that assurance, though he had no authority to make such guarantees, but the words needed to be spoken into the universe as a declaration of intent rather than a prediction of outcome. The hospital's automatic doors loomed ahead, reflecting his dust-covered figure, carrying a pregnant woman like some kind of construction worker angel, and Derek pushed through them with his shoulder while carefully protecting her belly from any contact with the doorframe. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos the moment he entered, nurses materializing from every direction with a wheeled gurney, their hands reaching to take the pregnant woman from his arms, but Derek held on for one extra moment, just long enough to see her eyelids flutter open briefly, just long enough to see her pupils focus on his face for a fraction of a second before consciousness slipped away from her again. In that brief moment of eye contact, something passed between them that Derek couldn't name. A connection forged in crisis that felt older than the moment itself. But the nurses were pulling her away onto the gurney and rushing her toward examination rooms before he could analyze the feeling. "Sir, what's her name? Is she your wife? Do you know her medical history?" A nurse with a clipboard fired questions at Derek, while he stood there dripping sweat onto the hospital's pristine floor, his hands suddenly empty and useless at his sides. He realized with dawning horror that he knew nothing about the woman he'd just carried 2 blocks. Not her name, not her story, not even whether she had family who would come looking for her. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty that settled into his bones like concrete setting. He wasn't leaving this hospital until he knew both she and her baby were safe. The nurse was still asking questions, her pen poised over the clipboard, her expression shifting from professional patience to mild irritation at his silence. But Derek's attention had fixated on the examination room doors where they'd taken the pregnant woman, and all he could think about was another hospital 25 years ago, where he'd been too young and too small to save anyone. Not this time, he thought. This time he was strong enough. This time he would stay. This time both of them would survive. 3 hours had passed since Derek had carried the pregnant woman through those emergency room doors. 3 hours of sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs that seemed designed to punish anyone who dared to wait for answers. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, with the persistence of mosquitoes casting a sickly yellow glow that made everyone look vaguely ill. But Derek hadn't moved from his position near the examination room, except to use the restroom once and to call his foreman with an excuse about a family emergency. The lie had cost him tomorrow's shift, possibly his entire position on the crew. But the thought of leaving before knowing whether the baby had survived felt impossible to contemplate. "Mr. Williams?" A young doctor emerged from the examination room, her scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, her eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who delivered too much bad news to too many families. Derek stood so quickly his chair scraped against the linoleum with a sound like a scream, his heart hammering against his ribs as he prepared for the worst. But the doctor's slight smile arrived before her words. "Both mother and baby are stable. The impact caused some bruising and she's severely dehydrated, but the baby's heartbeat is strong and there are no signs of placental abruption or premature labor." Derek's knees nearly buckled with relief, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the wall as breath returned to lungs that hadn't realized they'd been holding it. "Can I see her?" The question emerged before he'd thought it through, before he'd considered that he had no legal right or personal connection to justify such a request. But the doctor nodded with an understanding that suggested she'd seen enough of humanity's better moments to recognize genuine concern. "She's been asking for you," the doctor said, her eyebrows raising slightly with curiosity that she professionally suppressed. She doesn't remember much about the collapse, but she remembers someone catching her. She wants to thank her angel before he disappears. The doctor's tone carried the faintest hint of teasing, but her eyes remained serious as she continued. "I should warn you, she's very emotional right now. The stress she's been under isn't healthy for someone in her 3rd trimester, and she's going to need support that extends beyond today." Derek followed the doctor through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, past rooms where other families waited for their own miracles or tragedies, until they reached a private room at the end of the hallway. The pregnant woman lay propped up on pillows, her hand resting on her belly where fetal monitor straps created visible lines through the thin hospital gown. Her face cleaned of the dust and tears, but still carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting battles on multiple fronts. Her eyes, a striking shade of green that reminded Derek of deep ocean water, locked onto his face the moment he entered, and tears began streaming down her cheeks before either of them spoke a word. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion as her other hand gestured vaguely at the monitors surrounding her bed. "The doctor said if I'd hit my head instead of, if you hadn't been there, we both could have—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the tragedy that had come within seconds of destroying 2 lives, but her hand moved protectively over her pregnant belly in a gesture that communicated everything words couldn't. Derek moved to the chair beside her bed, suddenly aware of how he must look, covered in concrete dust, his work clothes stained with sweat and dirt, his hands rough and scarred from years of manual labor. He belonged on a construction site, not in this private hospital room, with a woman whose torn designer dress probably cost more than his monthly rent. But she was looking at him like he'd hung the moon and stars in her personal sky. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he said quietly, though they both knew that wasn't true, though the crowd of recording phones had proved that most people would have done significantly less. "My name is Victoria," she said, extending a hand that Derek shook with careful gentleness, mindful of the IV line running into her arm. "Victoria Shaw, and you are absolutely not anyone. You are the man who carried a pregnant stranger 2 blocks in August heat when you could have just called 911 and walked away." She studied his face with an intensity that made Derek uncomfortable, as if she was searching for something beneath the surface, as if his features contained answers to questions she hadn't yet asked aloud. "Derek Williams," he replied, releasing her hand but remaining seated, when every instinct told him to flee from the weight of her gratitude. "I'm just glad you and the baby are okay. The doctor said you were dehydrated. Have they been bringing you enough water?" The question felt absurdly mundane given the circumstances, but Victoria's face softened with something that looked almost like wonder, as if the simple concern about her hydration represented a kindness she'd forgotten existed in the world. "They've been wonderful, but—" Victoria's voice trailed off as her eyes shifted to the phone on the bedside table, its screen dark and silent despite the hours that had passed. "The hospital tried calling everyone in my recent contacts, my husband, my best friend, the people I thought would come if I needed them." Her laugh emerged bitter and broken, the sound of something precious shattering against hard reality. "Nobody answered. Nobody came. My husband left me 3 days ago. Left his pregnant wife to marry my best friend. And apparently when you abandon someone, you abandon them completely." The words hit Derek like a physical blow, his mind struggling to comprehend the level of cruelty required to abandon a pregnant wife in her final trimester. His father had left his pregnant mother, true, but at least he'd done it before any real emergency occurred. This man had deliberately removed himself from his pregnant wife's support system right before she was most vulnerable. "I'm sorry," Derek said, knowing the words were inadequate, knowing nothing he could say would heal that betrayal, but Victoria's hand reached out and grabbed his with surprising strength. "Don't be sorry, be here," she said urgently, her green eyes blazing with an emotion Derek couldn't quite identify. "Everyone else disappeared the moment things got difficult, the moment my pregnancy made me less convenient, less desirable, less worth their time. But you, a complete stranger, carried me to safety and stayed to make sure we survived." Her grip on his hand tightened as her other hand remained protectively on her belly. "I don't have anyone else right now, Derek. I don't have anywhere to go when they discharge me tomorrow. I don't have anyone to help me prepare for this baby or to drive me to my prenatal appointments or to just care whether we live or die." Derek's mouth opened to offer the spare bedroom in his modest apartment, to promise assistance he had no business promising, given his own precarious financial situation, but Victoria continued speaking before he could voice the offer. "I know we just met. I know this is crazy. I know you have your own life and your own problems, but—" She paused, her eyes searching his face with desperate hope. "Could you possibly stay just a little longer? Just until they discharge me? I can't be alone right now. I can't sit in this room thinking about how my husband is probably laughing with my ex-best friend while I'm here alone with our baby." The raw vulnerability in her voice made Derek's decision before his rational mind could catalog all the reasons why getting involved with a pregnant stranger's complicated life was a terrible idea. "I'll stay as long as you need me to," he heard himself say, the words carrying a weight of commitment that extended far beyond tonight's vigil. Something in Victoria's situation had activated every protective instinct Derek possessed, had connected with the 7-year-old boy who'd been too small to save his mother and unborn sister, had touched something in his soul that recognized this as a moment where the universe was offering him a chance to rewrite an old tragedy with a better ending. Victoria's tears flowed freely now, but they carried relief instead of despair, gratitude instead of grief. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand still holding his as if he were a lifeline anchoring her to hope. "You have no idea what this means. You have no idea who you're helping or what this moment will become. But someday I promise I'll show you that your kindness wasn't wasted on someone who couldn't appreciate it." Derek nodded, not understanding the weight behind her words, not knowing that the pregnant woman whose hand he held was actually Victoria Ashford, heir to a $24 billion empire, and that this moment of simple human compassion was being recorded in a ledger that would soon balance accounts in ways that would shock the business world. He only knew that the fetal monitor beside the bed showed a strong, steady heartbeat, that the woman in front of him needed someone to care, and that for the first time since his sister's death 25 years ago, he had the strength to be that someone. The night stretched ahead of them filled with awkward silences and tentative conversations, with Derek learning about Victoria's experience with pregnancy while carefully avoiding the painful topic of her absent husband, with Victoria asking about Derek's construction work, while deliberately not mentioning the empire she'd abandoned 3 years ago to test whether authentic love existed outside wealth's corrupting influence. Neither of them knew that in 10 days they would stand together in a ballroom where secrets would explode like bombs, where a mother's slap would trigger revelations that destroyed the corrupt and elevated the faithful, where the simple act of catching a falling pregnant woman would prove to be the first domino in a cascade that would reshape multiple lives and prove that the universe keeps meticulous accounts of every deed, especially those involving the most vulnerable among us. 10 days had passed since Derek carried Victoria through those hospital doors. 10 days of her living in his spare bedroom, surrounded by boxes of his late sister's belongings he'd never had the courage to sort through. Victoria had transformed the small space into a temporary sanctuary, her designer maternity clothes hanging beside Derek's donated work shirts, her expensive prenatal vitamins sitting on the bathroom counter next to his generic pain relievers. But the contrast in their belongings had never created tension between them. Derek's mother, Diane, had visited 3 times, bringing homemade meals and maternity supplies with the warmth of someone who understood what it meant to face pregnancy alone, never once questioning why her son had invited a pregnant stranger into his home. Victoria stood before the bathroom mirror in Derek's apartment, her hands smoothing down the elegant navy maternity gown she'd ordered online, the first piece of her old life she'd allowed to resurface in 3 years. Her pregnant belly, now impossible to hide or minimize, created a dramatic silhouette that the gown accentuated rather than concealed, and her reflection showed a woman who'd stopped pretending to be anyone other than exactly who she was. "Are you sure about this?" Derek asked from the doorway, his rented tuxedo fitting awkwardly across shoulders, built for carrying steel beams rather than attending galas, his discomfort with formal wear obvious in how he kept adjusting his bow tie. "I've never been more sure of anything," Victoria replied, turning to face him with an expression that combined determination and barely suppressed fear. Tonight, everyone learns the truth. Tonight, my ex-husband and his new wife attend the Ashford Legacy Gala, expecting to network with industry titans while avoiding any mention of the pregnant wife he abandoned. Tonight, his mother Eleanor discovers that the unstable gold digger her son warned her about is actually the woman hosting the entire event. She placed both hands on her pregnant belly in a gesture that had become habitual over the past 10 days. Tonight, everyone sees that Victoria Shaw and Victoria Ashford are the same person, and that the baby they all dismissed as an inconvenient mistake is actually the next generation of the Ashford Empire. The ballroom of the Ashford Tower gleamed with the kind of opulence that Derek had only seen in movies, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across marble floors, while 500 of the city's most powerful people mingled beneath oil paintings of Victoria's ancestors. Derek stayed close to Victoria as they entered through a side entrance reserved for VIP guests, his hand hovering protectively near her lower back as she navigated the crowd with a confidence that seemed to grow with each step. Nobody recognized her at first. The pregnant woman in the elegant gown was just another attendee to most of the crowd, but the event coordinator's face went ghost white when Victoria whispered her real name, and suddenly staff members were scrambling to adjust the program and prepare for an announcement that wasn't on any official schedule. "Is that Victoria?" The whisper started somewhere near the bar and rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water, heads turning to stare at the pregnant woman who'd been declared missing 3 years ago, phones emerging from pockets and purses to capture the moment when the vanished heiress reappeared. Derek felt Victoria's hand grip his arm tighter as the crowd's attention focused on them with the intensity of a spotlight, her breathing becoming slightly labored as anxiety triggered the baby to kick forcefully enough that Derek could see movement beneath her gown. Then the crowd parted, and Derek saw him, Victoria's ex-husband Marcus Montgomery, standing beside a woman who could only be the former best friend, both of them frozen in place with champagne glasses halfway to their lips and expressions of absolute horror spreading across their faces. Marcus looked exactly as Victoria had described him during late-night conversations in Derek's apartment, handsome in a way that felt calculated rather than natural, his expensive suit fitting perfectly across a body maintained by personal trainers, his face carrying the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, until now. "Marcus," Victoria's voice cut through the murmuring crowd with surgical precision, her tone level and controlled despite the chaos of emotions Derek could feel radiating from her body. "Thank you for coming to my gala. I see you brought Jennifer. How considerate of you to bring my former best friend to my family's annual charity event celebrating innovation and loyalty." The sarcasm in her voice could have etched glass, each word carefully chosen to draw blood without raising her volume above conversational level. An elderly woman materialized beside Marcus with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Eleanor Montgomery, Victoria's former mother-in-law, her face twisted with an expression that combined shock and rage in equal measures. "You!" Eleanor hissed, her finger pointing at Victoria's pregnant belly, like it was evidence of a crime rather than proof of life. "You're the pregnant woman who's been living with some construction worker? You're the one who's been telling people my son abandoned you." Her voice rose with each word, drawing more attention from the already captivated crowd. "Mom, don't—" Marcus started to speak, but Eleanor cut him off with a gesture as sharp as a knife slash, her attention fixated entirely on Victoria, with the kind of fury that only comes from discovering you've been systematically lied to by someone you trusted completely. "My son told me everything," Eleanor continued, moving closer to Victoria despite Derek's subtle positioning of himself between them. "He told me about your mental instability, your manipulative behavior, your desperate attempts to trap him with a pregnancy that probably isn't even his. He told me you disappeared for 3 years living God knows where with God knows who, and now you show up here pregnant and latched onto some poor construction worker you're probably manipulating with sob stories and—" The slap came so suddenly that even Derek, standing right beside Victoria, couldn't intercept it in time. Eleanor's palm connected with Victoria's cheek with a crack that silenced the entire ballroom. 500 people collectively gasping as an elderly woman struck a heavily pregnant woman's face in full view of security cameras and smartphone recordings. Victoria's head snapped to the side from the impact, her hand instinctively moving to cradle her belly protectively, her other hand rising to touch her reddening cheek. But she didn't cry out or stumble backward. She simply stood there, 8 months pregnant and freshly slapped, while the crowd processed what they'd just witnessed. Derek's body moved on pure instinct, stepping fully between Victoria and Eleanor with a presence that communicated protection without aggression, his voice emerging low and dangerous in a way that made several nearby men take involuntary steps backward. "You just struck a pregnant woman," he said quietly, each word deliberate and heavy with controlled fury. "In front of 500 witnesses. I suggest you step back before you do something even more unforgivable." But Victoria's hand touched Derek's arm, gently moving him aside as she faced Eleanor with a composure that seemed impossible given the circumstances, her green eyes blazing with an emotion that transcended personal hurt and reached into something older and more fundamental. "You slapped me," Victoria said softly, her hand still protectively on her pregnant belly, "because you believed your son's lies about me. You struck a pregnant woman because you thought I was a gold digger trapping some poor construction worker. You assaulted me in my own family's building because Marcus convinced you I was the villain in this story." Victoria took a single step forward, close enough that only Eleanor, Derek, Marcus, and a few nearby guests could hear her next words clearly, but the smartphones capturing video would pick up every syllable. "Eleanor Montgomery, allow me to properly introduce myself. I am Victoria Ashford, sole heir to Ashford Enterprises, and the woman hosting this gala that you're currently attending. The construction worker I'm supposedly manipulating is Derek Williams, the man who saved my life and my baby's life when your son's abandonment led to my collapse on a city street. And this baby you just threatened while striking me?" Victoria's hand moved in a slow circle over her pregnant belly. "This baby is your grandchild, carrying Montgomery blood whether you or Marcus choose to acknowledge it or not." The revelation rippled through the ballroom like an earthquake, phones capturing every angle of Eleanor's face as comprehension and horror replaced righteous fury, Marcus's complexion shifting from flushed to ashen as he realized the magnitude of his lies unraveling. Jennifer, the former best friend and new wife, actually took several steps backward as if physical distance could somehow separate her from the consequences accelerating toward them all like a freight train with failed brakes. "But don't worry, Eleanor," Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength as her hand remained protectively on her belly. "You'll never have to see this grandchild or acknowledge their existence, because what I'm about to do to your son, what I'm about to reveal about his theft from our baby's trust fund, his fraudulent credentials, his systematic financial abuse, will ensure that you'll be too busy dealing with criminal investigations to worry about family gatherings. And Jennifer?" Victoria's eyes shifted to the former best friend. "That teaching license you're so proud of, consider it revoked, effective immediately, once I release the recordings of you coaching Marcus on how to convince me my pregnancy was ruining our marriage." The ballroom erupted into controlled chaos as Victoria turned toward the stage, where a microphone waited, her pregnant silhouette commanding attention from every corner of the massive space. But Derek remained at her side, one hand hovering near her lower back in case she needed support, his presence communicating without words that anyone who wanted to harm her would have to go through him first. Eleanor stood frozen where Victoria had left her, one hand still raised from the slap that would become the most analyzed assault in business history, while Marcus and Jennifer whispered frantically to each other as security guards began moving in their direction. With the purposeful stride of people following very specific instructions, Victoria took the microphone with steady hands despite carrying 8 months of pregnancy and the weight of 3 years' worth of secrets. And when she began speaking to the crowd, her voice carried the kind of power that only comes from someone who survived the worst that betrayal can deliver and decided to transmute pain into purpose. The awards night had begun as a celebration of innovation and loyalty. It would end as the night when a pregnant woman's courage rewrote the rules of justice. The media firestorm ignited before Victoria even finished her speech that night. Video footage of Eleanor slapping a pregnant woman spreading across social platforms with the velocity of a pandemic. Hashtags like #ProtectPregnantWomen and #AshForJustice trending globally within hours. Derek watched from the wings of the stage as Victoria systematically dismantled Marcus's entire existence with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of someone who'd spent 3 years documenting every lie, every theft, every manipulation her ex-husband had committed, while believing she'd never have the power to expose him. The documents she presented on the massive screens flanking the stage told a story of systematic financial abuse. Marcus had embezzled over $2 million from the trust fund Victoria's family had established for their unborn child, funneling it into offshore accounts and luxury purchases for Jennifer, all while telling Victoria that her pregnancy expenses were bankrupting their household budget. The crowd's reaction shifted from shock to fury as each revelation built upon the previous. 500 of the city's most powerful people watching a pregnant woman expose the man who'd abandoned her, with evidence so comprehensive that several attorneys in the audience were already pulling out phones to contact the district attorney's office. Marcus tried to leave twice during Victoria's presentation, but security guards positioned at every exit prevented his escape with instructions that came directly from Victoria's second-in-command, who'd been managing Ashford Enterprises during her 3-year absence. Jennifer collapsed into a chair halfway through the presentation when Victoria displayed recordings of conversations where the former best friend had coached Marcus on how to convince Victoria that her pregnancy was destroying their intimacy and making her less attractive, suggesting he pursue women who still had their bodies instead of staying faithful to his pregnant wife. But the revelation that broke the internet and dominated news cycles for the following month came in the final 5 minutes of Victoria's speech, when she displayed her medical records from the night Derek had carried her to the hospital. The emergency room report documented not just dehydration and bruising, but also elevated stress hormones that had put her at risk for premature labor, combined with notes from the attending physician stating that the patient had no support system and had collapsed outside divorce attorney's office after learning husband had abandoned her while 8 months pregnant. Victoria let those medical records sit on the screens for a full minute of silence, allowing the crowd to absorb the cruelty of what Marcus had done before she delivered her final statement. Marcus Montgomery is not just a man who abandoned his pregnant wife, Victoria said into the microphone, her hand resting on her belly where their child continued kicking with oblivious innocence. He is a man who stole from his own unborn child, who manipulated his mother into believing his victim was the villain, who convinced my best friend to betray me during the most vulnerable period of my life, and who left me to collapse on a city street where I could have died along with our baby. Her voice cracked slightly on that last phrase, but she steadied herself with visible effort. If Derek Williams hadn't been walking past that exact spot at that exact moment, if he hadn't chosen compassion over convenience, neither I nor my baby would be standing here tonight. This man, she gestured toward Derek with genuine warmth, saved 2 lives that my ex-husband had decided weren't worth saving. The applause that erupted was deafening, but Derek felt uncomfortable with the attention shifting to him, his working-class instincts screaming that he didn't belong in this spotlight, that saving someone's life shouldn't require public recognition or reward. Victoria seemed to sense his discomfort because she quickly redirected the crowd's focus back to the consequences awaiting Marcus and Jennifer, announcing that criminal charges were being filed immediately and that civil suits would follow to recover every dollar stolen from the baby's trust fund, plus punitive damages that would ensure Marcus spent the rest of his life working to repay debts he could never fully satisfy. 90 days later, Derek stood in the nursery of Victoria's penthouse apartment, a space she'd purchased specifically because it had room for him to live there too, refusing to accept any argument that he should return to his modest apartment after everything they'd been through together. The nursery walls were painted a soft sage green with hand-painted clouds that Derek had insisted on adding himself during Victoria's final weeks of pregnancy, his construction skills translating surprisingly well to creating a peaceful environment for the baby girl they'd named Hope Diane Ashford, the middle name honoring Derek's mother who'd welcomed Victoria without judgment or conditions. Hope was 3 weeks old now, sleeping peacefully in her designer crib, while Derek and Victoria sat in the adjacent living room, reviewing the final reports from the legal team that had spent the past 3 months systematically destroying Marcus's life. The architectural firm where Marcus had worked as a senior partner had discovered his credentials were partially fabricated. He'd never actually completed his graduate degree, instead paying someone to create convincing forgeries that had gone undetected for 7 years. His professional license was revoked within 30 days of Victoria's revelation, his name removed from every project he'd claimed credit for, his reputation in architectural circles destroyed so thoroughly that even mentioning his name became professional suicide for anyone who'd associated with him. Jennifer had fared no better in the aftermath. The recordings Victoria released proving that she'd knowingly participated in emotional manipulation of a pregnant woman, violating ethics codes that governed her teaching position. The state education board had revoked her license within 60 days, citing moral turpitude and conduct unbecoming of an educator, effectively ending a career she'd spent 12 years building. The marriage between Marcus and Jennifer, built on the foundation of another woman's suffering, had collapsed within 40 days of the gala, each of them blaming the other for their joint downfall, their divorce proceedings becoming public spectacle as they fought over assets that were rapidly being seized to pay restitution to Victoria and Hope. But the most devastating consequence for Marcus came from an unexpected source, his own mother Eleanor, who'd spent the days following her assault of Victoria in a state of anguished horror as she realized the magnitude of her son's lies. Eleanor had appeared at Victoria's hospital room the day Hope was born, carrying flowers and a handwritten letter of apology that Victoria later shared with Derek, its pages covered in tear-stained ink, expressing remorse for believing her son's manipulation and for striking a pregnant woman who'd been nothing but truthful. Eleanor had done something that shocked the business community. She'd testified in the criminal proceedings against her own son, providing evidence of conversations where Marcus had explicitly told her lies about Victoria's mental instability and gold-digging behavior to ensure his mother would side with him if the truth ever emerged. The prosecutor says Marcus will probably serve 4 to 7 years for the embezzlement charges, Victoria said quietly, watching Hope sleep on the baby monitor while Derek sat beside her on the couch they'd chosen together at a furniture store where he'd insisted on paying for half, despite Victoria's protestations. Jennifer's facing civil suits from the families of students who claim her ethics violations extended beyond just our situation. Eleanor has established a foundation for pregnant women in crisis, donating $5 million as penance for what she did to me. Derek nodded, still processing how dramatically his life had transformed in less than 4 months, still adjusting to living in a penthouse apartment after 20 years in modest working-class housing, still learning how to navigate a relationship with a woman who happened to be worth $24 billion, but who also woke up 3 times each night to nurse his mind-corrected, her baby while he changed diapers and sang off-key lullabies. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked carefully. "Exposing everything so publicly, you could have handled it quietly, kept Hope out of the media spotlight." Victoria turned to look at him with those green eyes that had first opened in a hospital bed to see him covered in concrete dust and concern, and her expression held no uncertainty whatsoever. "Derek, that slap Eleanor gave me was captured on 50 different phones and broadcast globally within minutes. That moment showed the world exactly what happens when people believe lies about pregnant women, when mothers turn against other mothers, when cruelty becomes acceptable if you're convinced you're protecting your child from a villain." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. But what happened next? What I did in response? That showed the world what happens when you hurt someone who has the power to fight back and the evidence to destroy you. Hope stirred in her crib, making the small noises that indicated she'd wake soon for her evening feeding, and Derek stood automatically to retrieve her before she could work herself into a full cry. He'd become remarkably competent with infant care over the past 3 weeks, his large calloused hands learning to cradle fragile new life with the same gentleness he'd shown the day he caught Victoria falling on that scorching sidewalk. As he lifted Hope from her crib, the baby's eyes, already showing hints of Victoria's distinctive green, opened briefly to study his face before closing again in contentment. "Marcus is careerless, bankrupt, and facing years in prison," Victoria continued, as Derek brought Hope to her for feeding, the 3 of them settling into the comfortable routine they'd developed over these early weeks. "Jennifer has lost everything she built on the foundation of betraying her supposed best friend. Eleanor is spending her fortune trying to atone for believing lies and assaulting a pregnant woman. And me?" Victoria smiled as Hope latched on to nurse, her free hand reaching to touch Derek's face with tenderness that still surprised him. "I'm sitting here with the man who saved my life, watching my daughter grow, running my company from home while on maternity leave, and understanding for the first time in my life what it means to have someone choose you, not because of what you own, but because of who you are." Derek didn't have words adequate to respond to that declaration, so instead he simply wrapped his arm around Victoria's shoulders and watched Hope nurse with the kind of contentment he had never imagined possible 4 months ago when he'd been just a poor construction worker walking to his truck after another exhausting shift. The universe had kept meticulous accounts after all. His moment of compassion toward a collapsed pregnant stranger had unlocked blessings beyond measure, while those who'd chosen cruelty and betrayal had discovered that justice delayed was not justice denied, merely justice gathering compound interest that would eventually bankrupt them completely. The story that had begun with a fainted pregnant wife on a scorching sidewalk had ended with transformation, redemption, and the kind of poetic justice that people claimed only existed in fiction, except this was real, documented in court records and media archives, a testament to the truth that how you treat the most vulnerable members of society determines not just your character, but ultimately your destiny. And somewhere in a minimum security prison, Marcus Montgomery was learning that lesson far too late to change the outcome, far too late to undo the consequences of abandoning his pregnant wife and unborn child, but perhaps just in time to understand that the universe always, eventually, balances its books.